Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, State Representative Corey Mock, he's a Democrat from Grand Forks, is going to join me to talk about his proposed constitutional amendment for the Legacy Fund. Essentially, what he wants to do is make it, I suppose, a little bit harder for the legislature to spend Legacy Fund earnings. Now, this is the interest that the Legacy Fund kicks off. I know we've been talking about the Legacy Fund a lot on this show, and the reason for that is because it's a pot of billions and billions of dollars that our state government has with no defined purpose. I feel like talking about this thing is important, and there's been all sorts of fights over how to use it. And Governor Burgum, we had, Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford on the program earlier this week talking about, how the legislature hiding some of the revenues from the Legacy Fund. It's a big issue. Anyway, Representative Mock has a constitutional amendment that would, instead of automatically transferring revenues from the Legacy Fund to the general fund, would require that the legislature, just actually make a decision to do that. Otherwise, the funds would automatically go back, be reinvested back in the principle of the Legacy Fund. So anyway, we'll talk about that. And we end up talking about a lot of things, how to use the Legacy Fund, initiated measures a little bit. It was a fun discussion. But before we get to that, down in Bismarck yesterday, the legislature ended the era of the Sunday closing law in North Dakota. And really sort of culturally, that's a big shift. It's weird to think of how long we've been living with it here in North Dakota. I remember in the 90s when they started allowing, openings after noon. That was a big change. But, even now, you don't really plan a lot of your shopping for Sunday mornings because a lot of the stores, not all the stores by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of the stores end up being closed by law. So that's changed now, and it's a big cultural shift in North Dakota. It was a narrow vote. Earlier this year, the House passed it by a fairly wide margin. The Senate passed it by a narrower margin, and I have a feeling that there's a lot of people out there who are feeling like their nose is a little out of joint over this. Certainly, when I listened to the lawmakers debating this on the floor of the Senate, what I heard a lot of them saying is they're sort of hearkening back to a previous time that they've imagined where, families were together and Sundays were for rest and everything else. And that interested me, right? That sort of defense of the bill. And it got me to thinking, because I think we do that a lot in our society, in our culture. Certainly I think nostalgia, right, is an entire industry that, transcends other industries. Look at all the people buying things on vinyl. Look at the kids walking around today wearing t-shirts for concerts that happened, decades before they were even born. People have nostalgia for eras that they didn't even live in. Nostalgia is an industry. And I think sometimes that can obscure. Sometimes it's not a healthy thing, because sometimes I think we remember the good things and we forget about the bad things, or maybe even the good things we embellish and we make them better than they actually were. I don't know. I don't want to delve too deeply into that. I will say, though, that there's an interesting concept I've always thought about in politics, which is that it's better, if you want people to live a certain way, it's better for them to choose to live that way than to force them to live that way. Choice is always better than force. Now, the thing to keep in mind about this legislation that just passed, that is going to end, the blue laws, the Sunday close law, is that it's permissive legislation. It doesn't require any business to be open. If people don't want to shop on Sunday mornings, they don't have to. If a business owner doesn't want to open their doors Sunday morning or at all on Sunday, they don't have to. Their hours are still very much up to them. Private business owners can be open when they want and closed when they want. That's their decision to make. This doesn't force anybody to do anything. All it does is it allows something that wasn't possible before, which is for certain types of stores to open. Previously, they weren't allowed to. Now they can open. That's the change. And what we're doing here is not imposing some new order. We're just allowing choices to be made. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the people who think, well, Sunday ought to be for rest and, nobody ought to be shopping or working on Sunday morning. I don't necessarily agree with those people. We live in a different time. Maybe in a society where everybody was Christian and everybody had the same religious beliefs, Maybe, but we don't live that way anymore. The Sunday isn't the Sabbath for some people. We have atheists. We have, other people, they celebrate. I'm now trying to think of a religion that doesn't celebrate the Sabbath, the Sabbath's on a Sunday, and off the top of my head, I'm completely blanking, but they're out there. And by the way, just atheists, people who aren't religious at all and don't really care and they want to be open on Sunday or they want to be able to go shopping on Sunday. They should be allowed to live that way. I mean, that's obviously the affirmative argument for the Sunday closing. But going back for a moment to, the people who are invoking sort of the nostalgia for the good old days, nostalgia for the days when, families were together on Sundays, that doesn't have to end in your household. It doesn't have to end for anyone if they don't want it to. You could still choose to do that. You could do it Sunday morning. You could do it any day of the week. I mean, you don't need the government to impose. And this is why it surprises me that so many Republicans, were sort of clinging to the Sunday close law. There's nothing that you don't need the government to close down, businesses in order for you to have family time. You shouldn't need that. You should be able to do that, which brings me back to why choice is better than force. If you want people to live, and live out your idea of what family time is, if you want people to live, in accordance with your lifestyle or what you think their lifestyle ought to be, what you need to do is you need to inspire them to want to live that way. You need to inspire them to think that that's a sort of way that's worth living, that there are benefits to it. And if you inspire people that way, then they're going to do it, and it won't matter what the laws are. They'll choose to do it. But now, if given a choice, if they choose not to live their lives the way you want them to live, well, then you're just going to have to accept that. Because in a free society, the price of admission, and I say this a lot, the price of admission is that you're going to have to deal with some people doing things you just don't like. And you can disapprove all you want, and you could be critical all you want, and you could proselytize to them. You could try to convert them over to your way of thinking. You could do all of those things. That's your right in a free society. And you simultaneously can live your life in accordance with your ideas. You can do all of that. But what we should always avoid doing is imposing our will, imposing our lifestyles on others. Because A, all you're going to do is create resentment, and B, it doesn't really work that well. There's a saying, and I may have heard it from my father. My father's a military veteran, but there's a saying, and it's that the military, in the military, it says the commanding officer should never issue an order that he knows won't be obeyed. The idea is that if a commanding officer issues an order that's so absurd or that is so against the interests of the soldiers that they're just not going to follow it, then what you've done is you've undermined your own authority. And government, I think, very often can do this, can breed this sort of contempt for authority when we try to impose absurd laws. I think if we look at, the marijuana laws, for instance, they're flouted all the time. Marijuana is all over the place. It has permeated our society. Marijuana is outside of medical marijuana, which is, just now beginning to become available for sale under certain conditions in the state of North Dakota. But for the most part, marijuana is illegal in North Dakota, and yet it's everywhere. I'm pretty sure that if I really wanted to, and I don't judge people who use marijuana, but it's not my thing. But if I really wanted to, I'm pretty sure within an hour or so, I could probably find some marijuana to buy and use. It's that available. I would argue that there's probably more pot dealers in North Dakota than there are Starbucks. They're everywhere. They're probably even in our smallest towns. You could get access to some pot if you really wanted to. Now, when it's that pervasive, when you've got that many people doing it, and yet the law is illegal, what it does is it breeds contempt for the law. It breeds contempt for the authority of government. It breeds contempt for those who are tasked with enforcing the law. Now, if you don't want people to use marijuana, I don't think the proper course is to make marijuana illegal. I think the proper course is to inspire them not to do it. I realize that that's probably not very satisfying for some, because you're always going to have some people that are just going to do it. Hey, what can we do? Some people are just going to make bad decisions no matter what we do. Or decisions, I guess, you or I might consider bad. Maybe they don't consider it bad. But I mean, that's just the way it goes. Now, we need laws, obviously. I'm not advocating for anarchy here. We need laws. We need courts. We need to agree on some things. And those laws aren't going to be perfect, and we're not always going to all agree on what the laws ought to be. But generally, I think a good rule of thumb is that if you want people to live a certain way, work on inspiring them to live that way. But stop trying to force. Because when you try to force it, again, it just doesn't work. My interview with State Representative Cory Mock up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. State Representative Cory Mock, he's a Democrat from Grand Forks. He joins me now. He is the chief sponsor of House Concurrent Resolution 3055. Now, it's a constitutional amendment, so that means if the legislature passes it, it would need to be approved by the voters. And what it aims to do, essentially, is to make it, well, I think it would be fair to say make it harder to spend some of the earnings of the state's legacy fund. Now, the legacy fund's been the topic of a lot of debate this legislative session, and I think that's going to continue to be the case because it's a bigger and bigger pot of money all the time. It's got billions of dollars in it. It's kicking off as that principal grows. You know, the principal, of course, coming from a portion of oil tax revenues. As that principal grows, the interest it generates is going to continue to grow as well. It's now, hundreds of millions of dollars in a given biennium, obviously according to, depending on the earnings. And that becomes tempting for lawmakers. So, Representative Mock, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like your intent is let's make it harder to spend this money. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, that's certainly one way of looking at it. And it's not wrong. I mean, it would require the legislature to take action every 2 years and intentionally transfer earnings away from our investment account and deposit it to the general fund. Right now, the way it was set up was for 7 years, everything gets reinvested back into the principal, and it's hands off for the first 7 years. And then beginning on June 30th, 2019, and every biennium thereafter, the earnings would automatically dump back into the general fund to be used. And just so that your listeners, many of them may remember, but when this was passed, when it was created at the time, almost all oil revenue went to the general fund or the permanent oil trust fund. And there were some other constitutional funds that it fed into, but by and large, the state spent our oil taxes. And that other trust fund became known as a second general fund, which was why we set this up. It was called the Permanent Oil Trust Fund, but there was nothing permanent about it. We trained it just about every 2 years to balance the budget. And this was a way for us to ensure even generations after the last drop of oil is extracted from North Dakota's ground, that we would still have a legacy of that industry, of that oil wealth, working for North Dakota. And this would just make the default position. Any earnings would automatically go back into the principal unless we need it, and we withdraw it away and then put it into the general fund. You talked about at the beginning that those earnings payments are going to grow more and more. Right now, we're looking probably in the ballpark of $380 to $400 million is what we'll transfer over at the end of June, and that's going to be spent. Most of that is going to go into the Budget Stabilization Fund, just because of how our formulas and everything work. It'll boost our general fund budget, or our ending fund, beyond $65 million, and anything after that, those dollars go to the Stabilization Fund. And that's not all bad, but it's very difficult for us to return those dollars into the investment account, reinvest it, even if we don't need it. This would change it and make it a little easier for us to grow the principal long into the future.
Now, why do you think? I mean, obviously, so the intent is the legislature has to make a specific act. The money's not just going to show up from the legacy fund. If the legislature wants to spend that money, they've got to take a specific action to get access to it. Am I saying that right?
Yep, that's exactly right. That'd be exactly correct.
What are we protecting? And now I will say this: I have not been a fan of the legacy fund since we started, and the reason why is not because I'm against necessarily saving money. What I don't like is the idea that we're going to keep billions of dollars out of the private sector, right? I mean, when the government taxes us, they're taking money from the private sector into the government. So the legacy fund, I look at it, it's billions of dollars that the government has collected from the private sector for no defined purpose at all. And I'll say that bothers me a little bit. It's one thing to have some reserve funds, but we have reserve funds. This is something else. I don't know what we're going to do with it. I'm afraid that we're going to end up doing something pretty stupid with it, because as the money grows, it becomes a sort of moral hazard where it's there, and we're having these endless political debates. And, you know, you build one political movement in one legislative session, and all of a sudden you've done something with billions of dollars that can alter the course of the state's history for ill or bad. I worry about this. I'm not sure it was a good idea to create. It's there now, but, you know, I get a little frustrated with people saying, well, let's just keep growing it all the time. What are we going to do with this? I mean, when is this going to start benefiting the people of North Dakota? Otherwise, give the money back.
Well, so it's important to note that this is it's fed exclusively with oil extraction and production taxes.
They're taxpayers too.
Right. Well, no, absolutely. I cannot agree with you more. They are absolutely taxpayers. But I just want to make sure that we're not conflating that
Sure.
that is in some other funds.
Sure.
You know, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Alaska. It's not just their oil dollars that go into their permanent fund. They I think more than that.
It's the royalties. Actually, a lot of people don't understand Alaska's permanent fund is actually royalties. It's not. Ours is taxes. Theirs is royalties. And I think they've maybe added some other things. But when it started, and I was among the first people to actually get a check from the permanent fund when I lived up there. But yeah, it's you know, and to me that's a distinction. I mean, here we're levying a tax on the oil industry. Up there, it's more akin to North Dakota's Common Schools Trust Fund, where it's revenue from land or mineral rights that the state owns, and that's revenue that's coming to the state as opposed to us taxing private industry. So very different from Alaska. Right,
absolutely. And another important distinction is that whereas private owners, and of course the state has mineral rights as well on state lands, but in Alaska, all minerals are owned by the people of Alaska. So there are no private mineral rights owned in Alaska.
Yeah.
That was part of their statehood, which is why it is the royalty collections. 25% of royalties go into their permanent fund, and that's why they have the dividend checks.
Also, a lot of the oil development up there happens where people just don't live too. So that's
right. Well, that's true too. But so again, not to conflate the issues, but. You know, so again, I don't disagree that this is a taxes collected and it goes into this fund. And I will also share with you the frustration that the legacy fund has had no clear defined purpose. We don't have a strategic plan for it. We never have, and I don't know how long before we ever will. So it makes it very difficult for us, 141 legislators that meet every 2 years, not to mention the executive branch and everyone else who's got a good idea. We see this pool of money and we think, how can we spend? You know, and most people see it as $6 billion, but if you look at the earnings, if it's $400 million, everyone has a way of returning some of those dollars. In some cases, it's buying down other taxes. It might be investing in one-time projects. It could be starting new programs. Who knows what people have come up with? I know we've heard several ideas here this session. You know, it would be nice if we had a strategic plan. One of the thoughts that have come up by a lot of the original sponsors, many of us legislators, is that as that legacy fund grows, and because it does exist, and because you know, we know we can between the longevity of oil of the oil industry in North Dakota and the existence of the legacy fund, there's only one of those two that we as policymakers can have really any control over. We can't put more oil in the ground. So when the last drop is gone, if there's no more oil to be extracted, there's nothing much we can do. But we can manage this resource, the legacy fund, and make sure that continues to serve North Dakotans for generations. If we're going to have this, let's invest and use it wisely. Alaska, one of the frustrations that many of their policymakers have is they've got $64 billion in their permanent trust fund, and they're considering reintroducing an income tax because there's so many obligations that have been tied to those earnings that they don't have a lot of wiggle room. Their budget is largely built off of those earnings. And I want to make sure that North Dakota doesn't look at a $6 billion trust fund the same way I or you or I with let's just say $100,000 401k would look at it and think, wow, we're rich. We've got $100,000. Imagine all the things we could do with this money and then start obligating those earnings. If I wanted to redo my kitchen and spend $5,000, I could, I could draw the interest off of an investment account of about that size. Not saying that redoing my kitchen is necessarily bad, but the question is that the right $5,000 to use? Is that the right use of that money? It might be good today, but it's probably not the best for the future. Now, if we needed to save our home and pay the mortgage, if that was coming down to keeping our house or not, then taking $5,000 out of our investment account or a 401k is probably a prudent use of that money. That's the conversation I want us as a legislature to have is let's, in perpetuity, there are going to be some good ideas. There's going to be some necessities. We have those earnings. We don't know what the future is going to hold as far as federal dollars and programs and obligations. Let's instead of the default position being that all earnings come to our state's checking account to be spent, let's make the default that it goes back in the savings account, reinvest it. If we need to, we draw it out. It puts the legislature in the driver's seat. It prevents any program or initiated measure from obligating the use of earnings in perpetuity and taking that decision out of future legislatures' hands. I just think fundamentally it's the fiscally responsible thing to do.
I don't disagree. And I say that again as somebody, I didn't want to create the legacy fund to begin with. I think the whole concept is flawed, but we have it now. It exists. It's not going away. So, I guess in the meantime, let's not just have the money magically show up. Let's make sure that it's a conscious act, not just because I think we all know how money can just sort of sometimes casually get spent in the legislature. I know that sounds weird to say, given all the rigmarole that goes on down there, but sometimes it just kind of seems like all of a sudden we're just spending money that is there and it's easy to access. And I think making it a conscious decision where you have to go and actually it's like breaking a piggy bank, right? The old piggy banks didn't have a way. You had to actually break the piggy bank if you wanted to get the money in there. So you had to cross a sort of Rubicon if you wanted to spend that money. And I think that makes sense. And I support it as far as that goes. But I really think that this vacuum, because I think that's what it is. It's the legacy fund represents a vacuum. It's a bunch of money with no defined purpose. Do you think that that's going to become? I think it's going to become a problem down the road. I think at some point we got to figure out what we're doing with this.
Well, I mean, it can become a problem. Absolutely. And that's the problem. I mean, that's one of the challenges that we're facing. It was created in the 2009 session, approved by voters in 2010, and it's been building ever since. It seems like it's been a long time. We are still very much in our fund, in the legacy fund's infancy. And now as those payments are starting to be realized and those earnings are beginning to transfer over, that's when the conversation is going to occur. Is it a rainy day fund? And if so, you've got a lot of people in the state that would look at our budget and say, if this isn't raining, tell me what is. They have budget cuts and programs are being underfunded, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can find somebody in virtually every corner of the state that says that we could use this money for X.
I don't remember coming to I don't remember a single legislative session where a single state agency anywhere came and said, "Oh, we're adequately funded. We're just fine."
Well, right.
That doesn't happen.
And that's you're exactly right. I mean, especially in a public setting, no one is probably going to say, "We've got more than we need. Please cut our budget." You're exactly right. But it's but that's one of the challenges that we're going to start facing is more and more of those conversations. If you've got the money, we need you to spend it here. We want you to commit all of those funds or earmark those funds and set it aside into a separate fund so that it can be used to pay for Representative Hedlund's bill, an income tax reduction to buy down income taxes. That's one of the ideas.
How did you vote on that? How did you vote on Hedlund's? Because to me, I think that's the most interesting. You voted no. Okay.
Yep. I voted no. Yep, I voted no. And the reason is because, one, I learned from Alaska, again, talking with Alaska legislative leadership, when they used their permanent fund to get rid of their income taxes, it was fine. It worked. They were financially okay. Today, they're talking about reinstating the income tax because they're about a $1.6 billion budget shortfall. They can't maintain the infrastructure they have. And they've always said, they came back to us and said, for the love of all things holy, you need to keep that your revenue diverse. Keep rates low, but don't eliminate anything, because it's so much harder to come back should things change. And you think you can predict the future, and with a legacy fund or a permanent fund or Norway's $1 trillion oil fund that they have, you think you have everything made, but you never really know. We could see a massive change in how the federal government supports highway roads in North Dakota. And if they reverse the funding model, right now they pick up 80%, we pick up 20%. If they reverse that, that's another $500 million of a biennium that the state has to pay for. If Medicaid goes underfunded, but we continue to have to pay for those services, that could be, a lot of $1 billion.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, but you almost seem to be advocating a sort of policy paralysis here. I mean, just about anything could happen. I mean, I could use that argument against anything. We shouldn't do this because, these other things could happen. I don't know that they will happen. Maybe they won't happen, but they could happen. And we just don't know. I mean, we don't know a lot of things. And I feel like Alaska's problems have maybe more to do with just them eliminating their income tax years and years ago using the permanent fund. I think it probably has a lot to do with their budgeting decisions over years. They don't always make good ones either. And there's a lot of variables. And
they also have to manage us. Yeah, and they also have a state that's roughly half the size of the continental 48. Yeah. So they've got a large area to manage. With a population about the size of ours. Yeah. So, you're right. I mean, there are a lot of variables that go along with it. But I can remember
my sisters getting on bush planes to fly to like basketball tournaments. That's how big Alaska is. Right. Like you have to fly. Like it's not like hopping in the car and driving from Minot to Fargo. It's no, you have to fly sometimes. Sometimes because not just because it's like a 6-hour drive or an 8-hour drive, because there's no flipping roads either. So right. It's
the topography. It might be the equivalent of jumping in the car and going from Minot to Towner, but instead you got to hop on the bush plane to get from Minot to Towner.
It's a different world up there, which is why I'm always a little apprehensive when people start using Alaska as a public policy comparison. There's no place else in the United States like Alaska. All right, so what would you like? Last question: what would you like to do with the legacy fund? I mean, aside obviously you want to change a little bit, how we're handling the earnings coming off of it, but as a mission, as a vision for it, what would you like?
Well, I mean, here's how I'd like to see us approach budgeting in general. I mean, if we've got ongoing expenditures, that we should have ongoing revenue fund that. To use one-time windfalls to pay for ongoing operations it might work here and there, but it certainly is it poses a lot of budget challenges or risks down the line.
Aren't the earnings ongoing? Like, aren't the earnings from the fund? Because we're not talking about. I realize, like, the fund itself, the principal comes from oil tax revenue, but the earnings come from investments, which is a different thing.
Exactly. The earnings are ongoing, but there's also we really can't predict what the market will do with those earnings. When we conservatively put in $200 million last biennium and spent it 2.5 years before those dollars were even realized, which was a gamble. It was a fairly safe bet. I think everyone walked away going, we're pretty likely to have the $200 million transfer over. But if there is a severe market correction and those earnings were lost, we could have spent money that just never came into the bank. We're probably always going to have some earnings that transfer over or be available to transfer over, but the predictability of it is out of our hands. And when I say ongoing, I'm saying, we're talking operations, general government. If we're going to keep paying for, the Department of Corrections and health budget, education, et cetera, that we should have the revenue coming in dependably every 2 years, predict that, budget for it, that when we have these transfers, Bank of North Dakota profits that can be used strategically. You've got earnings off the legacy fund if we need to. If there is a significant one-time expenditure that we need to fund, whether it's the Fargo diversion, Minot flood protection, maybe we want to set up an endowment for entrepreneur scholarships. Who knows what could come out down the road? Something that would demonstrate a strong return on investment that could benefit North Dakotans that the legislature can weigh against all other projects and funding needs. I just really would rather see the legislature be in the driver's seat instead of us commit future legislatures on spending those earnings, committing it, tying our hands, and watching us limit the growth and potential of a legacy fund, knowing that so much uncertainty could exist.
So you're saying basically keep growing it, and then down the road leave future legislators free to use earnings to make strategic investments, that sort of thing.
Well, and of course, this is come with full public participation, and there's going to be projects that will come forward, right? But I mean, I do truly believe that the responsible action is for us to make the default position of the earnings to go back into the principal, and that it takes a conscious thought for us to say, nope, this is a worthy project. I think that we should transfer earnings over to use it for this project. And if at least it allows us to make that decision, to weigh it. It forces us to get public input. And again, if you were to ask any financial advisor, they would never tell you that your earnings should go back into your checking account, and then you get to make that decision at the end of the year whether you want to put it back into your 401k. It's a lot easier to let those earnings grow and to come back and to weigh that decision than it is to decide between that new video game and setting it aside for future use.
What's going to happen is we're some crazy billionaire from California or something's going to fund an initiated measure. And then we're going to spend it all on something stupid. That's what's going to happen eventually.
Well, and I will tell you that there's and I've been very cautious with how we approach initiated measure reform, whether it's initiated measures for statutes or constitution or the combination of the two. But I do think that we need to put something on the ballot that clarifies the process, provides some certainty. Yeah. I firmly believe that I support the initiated measure process, but when it comes down to amending the Constitution, I don't believe that the only difference between amending the Constitution and creating a law should be collecting twice the number of signatures to put it before the voters. I think amending the Constitution should probably have a slightly higher vote requirement. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of us changing much more than that, but I am not opposed to us raising that threshold to amend the Constitution, because we've seen now with Measure 1 with ethics, and we saw with Marcy's law, both laws that should have been in statute were put in the Constitution simply because it took the legislature out of our hands to meddle or amend or build upon, and the vote requirement for it to pass was exactly the same as it was to pass the law. So I really hope that we're smart on how we approach that. I do think that also puts in a nice firewall, a shutoff valve, if you will, to prevent anyone from coming in, creating a new program, dedicating legacy fund earnings for, and as I mentioned, it could be any number of things. It could be tax relief. It could be funding education. It could be a Green New Deal or universal health care. I mean, it could be anything. It could be conservative, it could be liberal. But if the voters approve of it and it uses legacy fund earnings without this shutoff valve, without the earnings automatically going back into the principal, there'd be very little that the legislature could do to manage or stop it.
You talk, and I'll let you go here, but you talked about not wanting to constrain future legislation. I mean, you could have some slick campaign. They go out, they spend money, they buy their signatures, or not buy their signatures, but pay to collect their signatures. They put their issue on the ballot. They get a couple of Hollywood celebrities and a couple of TV ads, and one vote of the people commits those billions of dollars in the legacy fund to something forever. Boom. Done. Now what do we do?
Right. Yeah, exactly right.
One whim of the voters, and now suddenly it's all down the toilet.
And it could be, and the only reason that I talk about the initiated measure process for this is because if it passes through initiated measure, that it takes 2/3 of a vote of the legislature, both the House and the Senate, to amend or repeal that for 7 years.
If it's in statute,
but there's also
if it's in the Constitution,
right? Exactly, yeah. Right. Well, right. If it's Constitution, it's another story. But if it's in statute, even then, the legislature has a higher threshold to amend or repeal. And that's the reason I talk about that. But there's also nothing stopping a legislature today from initiating a program, dedicating those earnings, and then tying that hand. The vote to change or repeal that is a simple majority, but the political pressure may be there, and that's what we've seen in some of like Alaska with the dividends. There's a lot of people think that they need to change the way the dividends work, but that's the political third rail in Alaska. No one can touch it because everyone, if you do, you're taking away
it's literally checks payment to the people,
Exactly right. So it's a lot more complicated. And I have to plead ignorance on this, but I've heard anecdotally that you look at a state like California, where the initiated measure process has really tied the hands of the legislature, that they're not really appropriating their funds, that a lot of that is appropriated, or the budget is managed mostly by initiated measure and not by the legislature. And that's put that state into a real financial pickle, if you will.
Well,
and
it's populism, and it's not good.
Right.
I would get rid of the initiative. Well, we could do a whole show on my misgivings about the initiated measure process, and you would disagree with me on a lot of it, but that show is not today. I would get rid of it. You would reform it a little bit, but that maybe one day we'll have that debate, Corey. Thank you so much for your time today.
I appreciate it, Rob, and we're happy to talk about this anytime.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out weekday mornings most of the time. I've had to skip here and there, but for the most part, weekday mornings, you're going to get a new episode of Plain Talk with some commentary from me and a newsmaker interview. You can subscribe to Plain Talk on pretty much every podcasting platform out there. If you're having trouble with one of them, please email rob@sayanythingblog.com. I'm happy to help you. You can use that email as well if you've got any feedback on the show, any questions for our guests. Weekly guests include Senator Kevin Cramer, Congressman Kelly Armstrong. They come on specifically to answer those reader questions, those listener questions, so send them in when you can. Also, follow me on social media. I'm at Rob Port on Twitter. You can follow me on Facebook. Just search for Rob Port. Say Anything Blog has accounts on Facebook and Twitter as well. Pretty easy to find. If you follow me there, say hi. I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.